Hey guys, how's it going? Jay Sensational here. Welcome back to the channel. So for today, we are getting the newest patch coming to Legends of Runeterra. If you missed the video yesterday where I reviewed and talked through the entire patch, I would implore you to check that one out because as of recording this video, the actual changes haven't really been inputted yet into the game as well as websites like runeterra.ar, where I am presenting these decks. So you notice here that Reavers Row costs 5 mana, whereas in a couple hours it will cost 4 mana. So today I wanted to showcase 7 decks that have recently been buffed by the patch. These won't necessarily be the best decks per se, but in the spirit of the patch, I wanted to highlight some of the cooler decks that I think are able to come out of the patch as a result to the shift in the meta, as well as the buffs that the cards received. So let's kick things off. Of course, we have to present to you Taliyah Reavers Row. This is it's been a fringe deck. I think that this deck has been a deck. I won't say it's very good. Stats actually say it's quite bad, but I think overall the deck has a certain power level to the deck when you do draw Reavers Row, and when you have Taliyah or Rite of Passage to bring it back. Reavers Row going down to 4 mana means that you can either execute it a lot earlier, going like Reavers Row into Time in a Bottle, for example, on turn 4. That can generate you a very, very scary board against some slower decks or decks that don't really expect it, or just even trading up into like a mid-range deck, for example. Reavers Row, of course, going down to 4 mana means they can curve Taliyah into it, and then you can use Imagine Possibilities or go into like a turn 6 with a very threatening attack and a very wide board as well. This deck is definitely very reminiscent of Thralls in a sense, where you still have like this landmark that you are really centered upon. You have ways of copying it, speeding it up, bringing it back, things like that. And because its countdown's only 2 or it only has a countdown of 2, I think this actually has a very, very suitable way of being like a pretty decent deck into some other control decks, and especially since I think the prevalent of Seraphine, which was definitely one of those faster control decks in the sense that they got to their equilibrium state a lot faster than many other control decks. Not a lot of decks can really handle the kind of pressure that is just a bunch of burst fearsome attackers with like 2-3-4 health. And yeah, it's a pretty funny deck if you guys haven't seen it. Aikado has a YouTube video on his channel, so I'd implore you to check it out. It was definitely a deck that I did want to highlight with the change to Reavers Row. Next up, we have Lulu Jinx. Jinx getting buffed so that she creates a rocket in hand on level up, means that she has access to a bit more burn earlier on. As I mentioned, since Seraphine is getting gutted in a sense, and there are some like decent replacements, but I do expect the meta to just become a lot more mid-rangey given the prevalence of cards like Varus, Jax, as well as Vayne. So I think some answers to this sort of mid-rangey meta is to go a lot lower into it, and historically a deck like Lulu Jinx is doing exactly that. You have the classic Lulu Flame Chompers or the Lulu Picks or Lulu Young Witch. You just have a lot of aggressive tools early on, and then you have Get Excited for Burn as well. Because Jinx is now giving you a rocket on level up, you get an additional 4 burn on top of it, especially if your opponent tries to remove Jinx. At least you get a little bit of payoff from leveling her and getting access to a bit more burn. Overall, I'm not entirely sure about all the cards in this deck. Harp is kind of an interesting one. Moral Support is more in there as a hedge towards the Vayne decks, towards the Jax decks, towards the Varus decks, because I do think that those will be pretty popular. And a card like Barrier is maybe better than a card like Twin Discipline, for example, yada yada. But overall, the concept stands. I'm not sure if Draven Jinx or like this discard aggro kind of deck is necessarily the better way to go. I think having some level of interaction that isn't forcing your opponent to choose how they block is actually pretty powerful, and this has been a deck that has done well in the past, so I'd be very curious to see it pop off again with the new Jinx buff. Next up is the one that I am the most curious about. This is a change to Laurent Duelist, going from a 3 mana 4/2 that gives a challenger this round. It's going into a 2 mana 2/2 that gives an ally in hand challenger. Sorry, grants an ally in hand challenger. And this is a very powerful concept because you can give any champion you want in the game a challenger. And when you think about what kind of options you have to that, you open up a lot of paths. And in this case, I chose to highlight Renekton with Akshan. Now, is Renekton the best way to do this? Probably not. Sivir with challengers, probably just a lot more standard, a lot more consistent, and a lot better overall. But I do like the concept of Renekton having challenger because it's super synergistic what he does. When he challenges a unit, he gets a buff, and it just enables him a lot easier. Given the newest set of tools with cards like Buried Armory, Darkened Bloodletters, Curse the Tomb, albeit getting a nerf to 3 mana, which is for some reason already shown here, but cards like Laurent Duelist are not, which is kind of curious, and like Heedless Resurrection. So definitely just another very similar deck to it. Now that rallies are getting nerfed, having the ability to just Cataclysm an overwhelm unit instead for 2 less mana, or even just 1 less mana without the barrier, I think is just a lot, is another path, an avenue towards winning the game. Because if you are playing Sivir Akshan, then you want to be playing like rallies, and that's 2 extra mana, whereas this deck, you can play like 3 Cataclysms. And if you can keep Renekton around, you have Riot Negation, you have Heedless Resurrection, then there might be an avenue towards winning the game in a lot faster manner. Is this better? Debatable, but I think a very, very cool option if you want to explore this Laurent Duelist card in a really cool mid-rangey deck. Next up, following, we have Ashe Thresh, a deck that I actually showcased, I believe, what is last season when I hit Masters with it. And I think it's actually going to be, Ashe overall is actually going to be in a pretty decent spot in my head, because again, when I mentioned that Seraphine is going to shift out of the meta, and then cards like Vayne, Jax, Varus are going to come in, freezes are a very, very good counter into both the Vayne cultists, or the Vayne decks overall, as well as the cultist decks as well. So having the ability to play Ashe, having the ability to play Quietus on top of that as well to destroy equipments or synergize the freezes, I think it's actually a very, very strong synergy going into the patch. Shatter is going down to 1 mana, so we essentially have an additional Quietus. Essentially what it is, you have the combo of like Icefield Archer Quietus, Icefield Archer Shatter, and it just adds a little bit extra consistency and control in the game plan. And at the worst case scenario, you can just use it as a 1 mana slow speed Frostbite to set up your Ashe turns, or even just use it's even like, I could compare it to a card like Arachnoid Sentry, where if you play it at slow speed, all of a sudden your opponent doesn't want to attack with that unit anymore. It's definitely a card that I think was already fringe on like almost being okay to play, but I just don't think that people really took the time to experiment with cards that weren't traditionally run in like Ashe decks. So I am quite excited for Shatter because I do think it has good potential. Again, this list is a little bit more quote unquote teched for what I think would be relatively popular. So I think that, like, you know, the mid-range decks, so you don't actually need that much late game, just 1 copy of Harrowing, you should probably secure the deal. Into the aggressive decks like Annie Jin, which I think is potentially only going to gain in popularity. I have 3 copies of Kindly Tavern Keeper. I have greatly reduced the expensive cards in this deck. I cut out the Rekindler, I cut out a Frozen Interfere, definitely thin down the deck, but again, just a very flexible deck overall, and has room to tech depending on the meta, or even like what decks you want to face in a tournament, and so on. Following that, we have the return of Ravenbloom Conservatory. I think, I'm not entirely sure if the change from countdown 12 back to 11 is actually good enough for this card to sort of reappear into the meta, but I do think in the place of Seraphine, there is a space for a Noxus PNZ deck to take advantage of the fact that a lot of decks that are looking to counter the Vayne decks, or even like play into the Vayne decks, I think, like, you know, having this PNZ Noxus tempo deck, there's an important spot in the meta for it, especially because people might think that there's not going to be a suitable replacement for this Seraphine deck. And so I just decided to experiment with it. I replaced some of the Seraphine cards like the Stuttering Song Spinners, put in the Ravenblooms, House Spider overall just fantastic card with Ravenbloom. And now we have to decide on what kind of champions we want. So I decided with Katarina and Annie, which I think were pretty traditional. You can play like a third Katarina if you want, but this is kind of just something I'm trying to test out. Things like Scorched Earth, I also think are going to gain a lot of popularity, especially into other Ravenblooms, into the Reavers Row. Landmarks overall are actually just pretty decently popular right now, and having it as a spot removal as well, I think is actually pretty sweet. Drum Soul, of course, still a fantastically broken card. You know, biggest fan, no longer played in the deck. You might get to play Loop Travelers if you have the room for it, but overall, just a very throwback to what used to be one of the strongest decks in the game. Definitely gone a lot of iterations through, and especially Ravenbloom Conservatory getting from 10 to countdown 12. Hopefully there's a nice equilibrium at countdown 11, especially given the fact that we do have Violent Discord introduced into the game as well. That does count for 2 procs for 2 mana. So hopefully we'll see Ravenbloom Conservatory come back in the game, especially because I think that flock decks are still very highly in need with the meta shift. Next up, Thresh Nasus. This one is definitely a little bit more alluding towards the Lulu Jinx deck, where I think if you go underneath the meta and beating Annie Jin just because you're like an anti-aggro deck, but still being fast enough to race the Vayne decks is going to be a pretty decent spot. And the change of Curse Keeper is the one that I want to highlight here, going to a 2-man or going into a 3/3 Cursed Abomination. Granted that that's not actually better into probably the Vayne decks. I think you'd rather have a 4-power card. But I do think with the introduction of Moonlit Glenkeeper as well, this deck does have some legs to stand on. Nasus, of course, if you can just absolutely drop a 10/10 on 6. You know, even if your opponent is running Frostbite, they're just not even trading profitably into the Nasus. And I think that, you know, having this ability to, with this combo, yeah, it's not as good, but you can Ravenous Butcher into Moonlit Glenkeeper on turn 3. So like Bakai Reaper into Curse Keeper into Ravenous Butcher, Moonlit Glenkeeper, absolutely bonkers combo. Or like even Darkened Bloodletter is just a fantastic way to Nightfall out Moonlit Glenkeeper. There's more of a Moonlit Glenkeeper showcase, but I do think that Curse Keeper has a chance. It is definitely better into the aggressive decks, so you can have a better anti-aggro deck. But still a little bit, actually the more I think about it, this probably isn't necessarily the best way to go about it, because I do think it's weaker into the Vayne decks, but it doesn't trade into 2/1, so there's that, I guess. So I don't know, that's why this video exists. I'm trying to try these out and trying to showcase some things that I do think might make sense going into the meta. Last but not least, I do want to talk a little about Varus, not necessarily because the deck really got any substantial buffs, apart from Varus himself, which got a very small touch-up, not from the fact that it's new or anything like that, but I just want to talk about its place in the meta going forward, because again, with the shift that is the missing piece of Seraphine within the meta, you're going to see, again, a lot more mid-range decks. And Unforgiving Cold is the one card I want to showcase that really, really makes a deck like this shine. Because you have the ability to just play a 4-mana Harsh Winds, double trade into that, and just come out very much so ahead. And then because you already have big units like Varus and Pantheon, just like the Faded units, Saga Seeker, of course, getting hit. But you can probably definitely build this outside of Target in other ways. But Unforgiving Cold just being an absolute monster, just completely annihilating any sort of mid-range deck, especially with the popularity of Vayne and the fact that I don't think Vayne is really going anywhere, makes a card like this very, very powerful, which makes a card like Varus being able to run all these cultist cards very, very strong. I don't know if this Pantheon Varus, which was very popular, or probably the most popular rather, going into the patch, because you do have the change to Saga Seeker going down to a 1/1. There might be a better combination for Varus, or you might play like Kai'Sa with another different cultist. It could be like Kai'Sa Kane, or, you know, you have room to play for it. The cultist package by itself is really non-committal in a sense. There's not really any synergies really pulling one way or the other, apart from, like, you know, needing to have an equip. But outside of that, it's just very non-committal in how you build a deck and what you decide to pair it with. You could pair it with like Demacia, for example. You could pair it with a Vayne, you could pair it with Kai'Sa, you could pair it with whatever that might be. And I think that's a cool part about the cultist set. But just I want to highlight Unforgiving Cold and how busted I do think it will be in the patch. But that's going to be it for me. Let me guys know what decks you guys are excited to try out in the patch, and I will be sure to try them out. I will be streaming later today around 8 p.m. EST over on twitch.tv/J3N3ational. Hope to see you guys there, but I appreciate you guys tuning in. Hope you guys checked out the patch video so this actually made some sense. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out, guys.